This is the kind of moment that quietly ends careers long before anyone admits it out loud. Because when Stephen A. Smith leans forward and asks whether the next 3 games decide Shedeur Sanders' NFL future, he's not being dramatic. He's being ruthless in the way only reality can be. There's no grace period in this league. There's no patience clause written into contracts. And when a young quarterback steps onto an NFL field and the offense can't reach the end zone, when the stat line fills up with interceptions, sacks, and frustration, the league doesn't ask how hard the situation was. It asks whether you survived it. That's why this conversation hit like a punch to the chest. Not because Shedeur Sanders struggled in sub-zero conditions, not because Cleveland got embarrassed, but because the evaluation clock is ticking loudly now. This wasn't a developmental stumble. This was a warning siren, and Stephen A. didn't soften it. He didn't frame it as growing pains alone. He framed it as a crossroads, because the NFL doesn't wait for potential to bloom forever, especially when decision-makers already have draft picks burning holes in their pockets and job security hanging by threads. The terrifying part for Shedeur isn't that he played poorly. It's that he played poorly at the exact moment the league starts deciding who gets patience and who gets replaced. And once that conversation starts, it never really stops. Here's why this exploded the way it did. Coming off a breakout performance against Tennessee, Shedeur Sanders walked into a brutal environment against Chicago, and everything fell apart. 3 interceptions, 5 sacks, 0 trips to the end zone, a 31-3 blowout loss that wasn't competitive at any point. Cleveland now sits with only 3 wins on the season, and suddenly the questions shifted fast. Not just about the quarterback, but about head coach Kevin Stefanski and whether his job is safe. When Stefanski brushed off those questions and said the focus was on Buffalo, it didn't calm anything down. It poured gasoline on a debate that's been simmering all year. Who actually has more at stake right now? The 2-time coach of the year, or the young quarterback essentially auditioning for his NFL future every Sunday? That's when Stephen A. made it clear this wasn't a trick question. It was Shedeur Sanders. And before we go any further, if you want this kind of unfiltered breakdown where the stakes behind every snap get laid bare, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, because this is where the real NFL conversations live. Stephen A.'s reasoning was cold, calculated, and impossible to ignore. Kevin Stefanski, despite an underwhelming season, has a resume. 2 Coach of the Year awards, a playoff appearance, a playoff win. If Cleveland moves on from him, Stephen A. believes he'll land on his feet. Another team will call. Another opportunity will exist. Coaches with that pedigree get recycled quickly in this league. Quarterbacks don't get that luxury, especially quarterbacks who are already viewed as polarizing. And that word mattered, polarizing, because Stephen A. wasn't just talking about performance. He was talking about perception. Fair or unfair, Shedeur Sanders doesn't enter evaluations with neutrality. Opinions are already baked in. And when that's the case, your margin for error shrinks dramatically. What made this take even more uncomfortable was the irony Stephen A. pointed out. Cleveland's commitment to Stefanski may actually hinge on how committed they are to Shedeur. Because if the Browns decide they're drafting a quarterback at the top of the 2026 draft, and they have 2 first-round picks to do it, timelines suddenly matter. You don't want a head coach on the hot seat while you draft a franchise quarterback. That's how instability multiplies. Stephen A. even referenced how that scenario has played out elsewhere, not to mock, but to warn. And that's why he said Shedeur has more at stake. Because if Cleveland decides he's not the guy, there's no guarantee another team gives him the same runway. Not with how fast this league moves. The pushback came immediately. The argument for Stefanski being the one in danger wasn't weak. It was emotional and logical. This is Stefanski's offense. Even if he's not calling plays, it's his system. And offensively, the Browns have been dreadful. The defense has done its job. Jim Schwartz has earned praise. But the offense hasn't held up its end. That disconnect puts the spotlight back on the head coach. And when you start listing the chaos Cleveland has gone through at quarterback, the criticism gets louder. Veteran experiments, short-term solutions, young players shuffled in and out with little stability. From that perspective, Shedeur Sanders didn't walk into a functional environment. He walked into turbulence. Stephen A. didn't deny any of that. In fact, he leaned into it. He made one of his signature points, one he repeats across sports because it cuts straight to accountability. Whatever your signature is, that's what you're judged on. Stefanski was hired as an offensive mind, an offensive coordinator. That's his calling card. And when the Browns' offense ranks near the bottom in yards per play, total QBR, yards per game, and points per game, that's not just a quarterback problem. That's an identity crisis. Stephen A. emphasized that this isn't about one quarterback failing. It's about a pattern. Over the years, Cleveland has cycled through quarterback after quarterback, and at some point you have to ask the uncomfortable question, is it them or is it you? That's where Shedeur Sanders comes back into the frame, and Stephen A. refused to let him off the hook either. Since taking over in Week 12, the numbers are rough. Low scoring output, completion percentage near the bottom among qualifiers, interceptions piling up, passer rating lagging, success rate struggling. These aren't cherry-picked stats. They're the reality of what's happened on the field. Stephen A. acknowledged that injuries, missing receivers, and offensive line issues complicate the evaluation. But then he delivered the line that defines the entire debate. Those factors won't stop the league from judging Shedeur. And if they don't stop the judgment of the quarterback, they can't stop the judgment of the coach either. This is where the tension really builds. Because on one hand, Shedeur Sanders looks like a young quarterback dealing with growing pains in a bad situation. On the other hand, the NFL doesn't grade on curves. It grades on results. Stephen A. made it clear that when you're a quarterback, fair circumstances are a luxury, not a requirement. And that's why the next 3 games matter so much. Not because they erase what's already happened, but because they shape the narrative that follows him into the offseason. Every snap now carries weight beyond the scoreboard. It affects how the locker room sees him. It affects how front offices talk about him behind closed doors. It affects whether Cleveland views him as a bridge, a future, or an obstacle. Stephen A. even acknowledged the possibility that if improvement continues, the Browns might see him as a bridge quarterback. But that's not the same as security. That's not the same as belief. And in a league where teams are constantly hunting for certainty, being a bridge is a fragile place to stand. The most damning part of the conversation wasn't directed at Shedeur at all. It was directed at the Browns as an organization. Stephen A. laid out the resume. 1 playoff win in years. Constant turnover at quarterback. Offensive struggles year after year. When Baker Mayfield looks good elsewhere, questions get louder. When other quarterbacks leave and stabilize, fingers point inward. And when the same issues repeat, regardless of who's under center, the blame shifts upward. Still, Stephen A. circled back to the original alarm he sounded. Shedeur Sanders doesn't have the benefit of institutional patience. Kevin Stefanski does. That's the brutal truth. Coaches get second chances. Quarterbacks get labels. And once those labels stick, they're hard to peel off. That's why the next 3 games feel like an audition. Not for greatness, for survival, for relevance, for the chance to be seen as someone worth building around, rather than someone teams feel they can replace. This isn't about panic. It's about timing. And the timing couldn't be worse for Shedeur. The Browns are losing. The draft capital looms. The offense is struggling. And every decision Cleveland makes from here on out sends a message. Stephen A. didn't say Shedeur's career ends in 3 games. He said his future trajectory might be decided there. And that's a distinction only people who understand this league truly grasp. Because in the NFL, you don't need to be declared finished to be finished. Sometimes all it takes is doubt at the wrong moment. And right now, doubt is louder than applause.